I'm so beyond excited to be in conversation with you, Arundhati. Thank you for saying yes. we were we were like pinching ourselves. We couldn't even believe you said yes to us.
we were out of control when you said yes.
We're very excited. Thank you for being here.
I am Machochodi Makhene. I am one of the co-founders of Love is a Kind of Cure, along with Clevis Natera. We are so honored tonight to be joined by Arundhati Roy, who is a Man Booker Prize-winning author and the very celebrated, deeply beloved writer, activist, thinker, living ancestor to a lot of us, who many of you know from The God of Small Things. She has also written countless really important essays and nonfiction that spurs our imagination about what humanity should or could look like. That's what we're really excited to speak with her today about. And 20 years after her first novel, she released The Ministry of Utmost Happiness, which is such a beautiful and deep and expansive book. If you're looking for something to read right now, I mean, I know you've read The God of Small Things, so this is the time, if you haven't already, to pick up The Ministry of Utmost Happiness. We're so delighted to be joined by her. I'll let Clevis, my co-founder, say a few words as well.
Thank you. Thank you for those words. That's beautiful. I think for those of us that grew up imagining the role of the artist as activist, Arundhati Roy remains really the gold standard. And part of the reason why we want to have a conversation with Arundhati is because when Mahohodi and I started thinking about love as a kind of cure, Arundhati Roy's piece in the Financial Times, where she talked about this pandemic as a portal, was an absolute big point of departure for us in our imagination about what our movement would be. And one of the things I love most about Arundhati Roy is the fact that her work continues to be rooted in love. It continues to be rooted in personal responsibility, in transformation through each of us, owning really our role in change. And so I'm so beyond excited to be in conversation with you, Arundhati. Thank you for saying yes. we were like pinching ourselves. We couldn't even believe you said yes to us.
Why? We were out of control when you said yes.
Oh, come on.
We're very excited. Thank you for being here.
Oh, you're welcome. I'm delighted to be here. Delighted.
So as a beginning, Arundhati, I wonder if you can start us off maybe with a reading from one of your novels.
Yeah, I think, what I'd like to do is to just read a little bit from, my work over the years. And I think because it's called Love as a Kind of Cure, this festival, I'll start by reading a section from The God of Small Things, which I've marked up, which really is about the love laws. I'm going to, skip a few paragraphs here and there for time, but hopefully it'll make sense. So that's The God of Small Things, my very old first edition, all marked up, all yellow now. Yeah. Though you couldn't see the river from the house anymore, like a seashell always has a sea sense, the Imanam house still had a river sense, a rushing, rolling, fish swimming sense. From the dining room window where she stood, with the wind in her hair, Rahil could see the rain drum down on the rusted tin roof of what used to be their grandmother's pickle factory. Paradise pickles and preserves. It lay between the house and the river. They used to make pickles, jams, squashes, curry powder, and canned pineapples, and banana jam illegally after the Food Products Organization banned it, because according to their specifications, it was neither jam nor jelly. Too thin for jelly and too thick for jam. An ambiguous, unclassifiable consistency, they said, as per their books. Looking back now to Rahel, it seemed as though this difficulty that their family had with classification ran much deeper than the jam jelly question. Perhaps Ammu, Esther, and she were the worst transgressors, but it wasn't just them, it was the others too. They all broke the rules. They all crossed into forbidden territory. They all tampered with the laws that lay down who should be loved and how much. The laws that make grandmothers grandmothers, uncles uncles, mothers mothers, cousins cousins, jam jam, and jelly jelly. It was a time when uncles became fathers, mothers lovers, and cousins died and had funerals. It was a time when the unthinkable became thinkable and the impossible really happened. In a purely practical sense, it would probably be correct to say that it all began when Sophie Moll came to Imanum. Perhaps it's true that things can change in a day, that a few dozen hours can affect the outcome of whole lifetimes, and that when they do, those few dozen hours, like the salvaged remains of a burned house, the charred clock, the singed photograph, the scorched furniture, must be resurrected from the ruins and examined, preserved, accounted for. Little events, ordinary things, smashed and reconstituted, imbued with new meaning. Suddenly they become the bleached bones of a story. Still, to say that it all began when Sophie Moll came to Imanum is only one way of looking at it. Equally, it could be argued that it actually began thousands of years ago, long before the Marxists came, before the British took Malabar, before the Dutch ascendancy, before Vasco da Gama arrived, before the Zamorin's conquest of Calicut, before 3 purple-robed Syrian bishops murdered by the Portuguese were found floating in the sea, with coiled sea serpents riding on their chests and oysters knotted in their tangled beards. It could be argued that it began long before Christianity arrived in a boat and seeped into Kerala like tea from a tea bag, that it really began in the days when the love laws were made, the laws that lay down who should be loved and how much.
Mm.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. It's exquisite.
Thank you.
I would like to ask you a question that goes directly to the heart of what you're talking, what I hear when you talk about love and the laws of love, right? And that the laws of love were laid down so long ago, before the British, before the Dutch, before all of these imaginations of what we think of as history. I'm curious because, you know, the thing that we're contending with right now the most in the States, and I would argue in South Africa, in a lot of parts of the world, is this very deeply entrenched understanding of race and very deeply entrenched, or at least hundreds of years entrenched understanding of race here, right? And what you're arguing is actually these divisions are a lot older than we imagine, and the distinctions between who gets to be loved and who does not, and how. I'm curious, you know, it's almost an overwhelming thing of how do we understand the beginning of those laws, how they were laid down, and how we understand the laying of those laws must dictate how we unravel the laying of those laws, right? So how do you pass that in your mind?
Well, I guess, you know, I mean, living as I do and having grown up as I have in India, and it's in particular in an Indian village, you know, to us, the laws of race that exist in Africa and in the Western world translate into this very ancient caste system in India, which is probably the most brutal kind of system of social hierarchy, intricate also. And the difference between race and caste, I would say, is that somehow caste has been given a divine sanction by Hindu texts, you know. So people who are considered the lower caste, who are the oppressed and dominated castes, are told that they are living out the sins of their previous lives. And so there's a kind of fatalism that, you know, a lack of anger, a lack of rage that, you know, people who consider themselves political or activists or anything, you know, over here it's more like you have to first awaken the anger before you can do anything else, because that is, you know, it's a society that has existed before, way before there was a country called India or any such thing, you know. Centuries old, this kind of stratification of society. And so obviously, you know, the conflict between human beings, tribe on tribe, race on race, and the consolidation of domination, a consolidation that is never overturned, you know, results in creating this kind of stratification. So in India, you know, anti-caste intellectuals often say that what there's a historification of mythology and a mythologization of history. So you have the dominant caste who think of themselves as Aryan, who came and basically made war on the local Dravidian, more dark-skinned communities, and then turned those victories into a mythological situation in which the fair-skinned became the gods and the dark-skinned became the demons, and then the mythology is just so elaborate because it's so old, you know. But I'd say variations of this is what racism is all about, right? And then today, consolidated, and this to me is extremely important, that domination is consolidated by capitalism and by forcing people to accept that as a natural order, you know. So in countries like the US, you know, to question that is almost like something that's been written out of people's minds for so many decades, until I think the Occupy Wall Street movement brought back the language of class and caste and race, which have to be seen together. Because unless there is revolutionary thinking, unless something is overturned, those layers that of domination acquire a kind of eternity, you know, a kind of validity, a kind of permanence, which is false. But because it is considered wrong to be a revolutionary thinker or doer or to live on the front lines. And it's therefore, Clavis, what you were saying when you introduced me, you know, the idea that there's something, they have taught us over years that you've got to worry about being political when you create art, because there's something wrong with art that's political, you know?
Well, it's interesting because you've come under fire, right? Especially when the Ministry of Utmost Happiness came out. I remember a lot of the reviews that were written were really talking about the complexity of pulling off being an activist and being a writer, as if those things should live apart. And as writers, Majo Jodi and I have spent a lot of time talking about, like, who gets to be apolitical as artists, the kind of entitlement that exists even in this idea that the most pure art is an art that is devoid of politics. And it has always felt to me
yeah,
go ahead,
I mean,
please.
I remember, you know, I've sort of sometimes just set myself, you know, to read, let's say, the first 2 pages of a very privileged white, very, you know, very well-known novelist, and I would just write down the things, the objects in those in those in those paragraphs, which are just taken for granted, you know. The just the objects are so terrifying, you know, like that these objects, each object in itself is a kind of to some of us a violence, you know, but it's so beautifully taken for granted by people who are so entitled and so used to privilege. So it has been very important to kind of leach the politics out of art, to leach the politics out of all kinds of discourse as well, you know.
But is there really such a thing? I mean, is there such an artwork that is apolitical? Because, you know, one of the things that my mind always goes to is, I grew up, as I said, in South Africa, and during the struggle, as well as after, quite frankly, there's a lot of artwork that looks as though, I mean, one of the things that's actually my favorite things to do is look at artwork that was made during the height of apartheid, so in the 80s and the 70s, and especially to see it across a broad spectrum, right? So by broad spectrum, I mean different kinds of people making art. And when you see some work, say for example by Goldblatt, and he's very provocative in these beautiful images of just daily life. But when you see daily life as it exists during our war, right? For a lot of white, ordinary South Africans, and you see the violence of this peace, this nothing is wrong here, nothing is really happening. That is the most political, that is the most provocative. And I think Goldblatt knew what he was doing when he captured those images. So I always question this idea of just how apolitical can anybody's work really be, because even in ignoring what is all around you, you're making such loud statements.
Yeah. It's like I ask, you know, how is it possible for so many Indian intellectuals on the left as well, you know, to have written so much celebrated work, academic work, fictional work, artistic work, cinematic work, and not mention caste. It's like, to me, exactly what you said, you know, working in South Africa and omitting to mention that there was apartheid, you know, how much celebration, uncomplicated celebration of Gandhi, for example. I mean, all of us have been just indoctrinated with what we thought were the teachings of Gandhi until I began to read about what happened in South Africa and what happened with Gandhi and Ambedkar, the great Dalit leader, and so on, you know. So it's very interesting to ask that question, you know, that but that's exactly what I'm saying, you know. So if you talk about something, then it's considered a bit vulgar, you know, like, why are you just disturbing the grass here, you know, and so on, without trying to, without keeping your eyes open, without addressing what's going on. It's definitely a kind of politics, you know. It's definitely a kind of politics. It's like, you know, the joke with, you know, people who belong to the sort of upper caste who say, I don't know what caste I am, right? Right. Wow.
Right, that's your luxury, to not have to know what caste you are, because it's not imposed on you daily.
Yeah.
Well, I think
I I have a question about your work. I'm really curious about a through line that I've seen both in your novels and in your nonfiction is that you do challenge the idea of love and boundary breaking love and love among people who are supposed to be divided. And, you know, when I think about the ministry of utmost happiness, I think about, you know, just even in the main character, right? That you made the decision, that choice to have a trans person being represented. As a parent, you know, I mean, these rules that really have not been represented, people that have not been represented. You know, I would argue too in the first novel, you also did that, where you were really challenging the idea, that beautiful passage you just read to us about who gets to love and how much. So to me, I really want to talk to you about this idea of solidarity through love, because I think it is something that I have seen in your work, and I think is one of the most compelling reasons to resist, is because
it's such a nice thing for me, you know, to hear you who's reading my work from outside of India and taking love from it, you know, because here we are living in a tidal wave of hatred, of trying to mark out people to hate, and you know, so the amount of hate that comes towards somebody who is talking about love is extraordinary, you know. And in the Ministry of Utmost Happiness, what happened is that I didn't plan it, because my novels are not like some theoretical sort of experiment. But what happens is that, you know, because of who I grew up in, the village in which the God of Small Things is set, and that's a very traditional community. And because my mother had married outside the community and then divorced, it was like I just didn't belong to anybody, not to the oppressed, not to the oppressor, not to anyone. Everyone was just like, no one will marry you, and you know, you should just like forget it. I said, and so I learned very young to say, but you know, I don't want to marry any of you. Thanks a lot, you know, like thanks, but no thanks. I mean, one just was longing to get out, you know. But in growing up, looking at that fine grid of caste and you know, hierarchies and so on, and not belonging, what happens is that in a society like India, where it is so finely etched, like everyone thinks India is anarchic and you know, Bollywood and blah blah blah. It's not anarchic at all. It is the most rigid society you can imagine. And so if you don't fit into one of those grids, as I don't, then you automatically seek, I think, the others that don't fit into the grid, you know. And that grid is not just about gender or caste, or it's so all the characters in the Ministry of Utmost Happiness, I realized later after I'd written the book, have the grid, the boundaries of the grid running through them. So Anjum, for example, she has a gender boundary running through her, but she's also a Shia Muslim who is born in Old Delhi and now living in this Hindu national state where Muslims are being lynched, Muslims are being mass killed. Okay, so her Muslim identity is more dangerous than her identity as a hijra, which is what the Urdu word for what is called trance, you know, so the holy soul trapped in a body. And her brush with violence comes when she encounters the crowd that in 2002 was the Hindu vigilantes who massacred almost 2,500 Muslims on the streets. And she watches the massacre, but she is spared because they say it's bad luck to kill hijra, you know. So her Muslim identity gets her into danger. Her trans identity actually saves her. So, you know, you have this fine mesh of things. You have another character called Tilotoma who has the border of caste running through her. You have a Dalit character called Dayanand who converts to Islam and calls himself Saddam Hussein and goes around with a video of Saddam Hussein's execution in his phone because he's so impressed by the dignity with which he went to his death. He says he must have been a bastard, but I want to be a bastard like him, you know. And then you have Kashmir, which is like the most incendiary border in India, you know, where it's a border of nation on nation, and you have a character like Musa. And when I read from Utmost Happiness, I'd like to read about Kashmir because here you can't speak about Kashmir. So you tell me that I write about love, but I go to speak, they smash the stage, they break, they threaten you with death. Just before the ministry came out, a great Bollywood actor who's a member of the ruling party, who's a member of parliament in the ruling party, said that I should be used as a human shield in Kashmir, you know, by the army. So you have this kind of, love itself is so hated. You know what I mean? That is, people who marry intercaste are beheaded, are killed. Love is the most dangerous thing. Inter-religious marriage, people are lynched. You know, love jihad is a big political trope here. Oh, the Muslims are trying to do love jihad on Hindu girls. So love is a dangerous, dangerous thing, you know. And in the God of Small Things, I was taken to court for years for corrupting public morality, for obscenity. And the obscenity was not, what offended them was not the physical lovemaking between a man and a woman. What offended them was that you are looking at the physical beauty of two bodies, a man's body and a woman's body, and the man happens to be Dalit. You know, now that is just unacceptable, right? That is what even today people are being killed and beheaded for. So love is a very, very dangerous thing. You know, it is a cure, but because it's cure, it is also hunted down.
Yeah, well, and I think that part of what I found really inspiring in your work is that I think it's clear that the reason it's dangerous and the reason that love is persecuted is because of its power, because it does have the power to overthrow, and it has the power to open up the imagination and to create this vision of what could be into the future, which wouldn't exist otherwise. I mean, how else do we shepherd new ideas of identities and the potential for each of us to reach our full humanity, if not through opening it up?
It's true, exactly. It's through every kind of love, right? Through physical love, through intellectual love, through intelligent love, through brotherly love, sisterly love, all kinds of solidarities that have to be forged, you know. So in the God of Small Things, you know, sometimes some people said, oh, you know, why have you objectified the Dalit body? I said, is there a single body, a single character in this book whose body has not been described, whose beauty and craziness has not been described? But the idea of a society in which you have a man who's been looked at by a woman with sexual desire, and he happens to be Dalit, is so dangerous, because for them that is not a human being, you know. So that is dynamite when you present in the world of imagination. Not only is he a human being, he's a beautiful, attractive, desirable human being, you know. So it is something which is at the core of caste and race, you know? Well, yeah, and equally in the ministry, you know, so there's this kind of, why can't we talk about democracy? And, you know, you'll have people on the left who are campaigning for Palestine as people should, but the atrocities that are being committed in Kashmir, they don't figure, you know. So you are allowed to have this being done in your name. These these graveyards, gravestones growing out of the ground like young children's teeth in this valley of murdered people, and this battle going on, and you just digest it and call yourself a democracy. Don't write about it, but you can create art and say that it's not political. But it's like, honestly, to write about this land without looking at Kashmir, without looking at what has been done in the northeast of India, what has been done in the caste system. It's like twisting yourself into a complicated yoga asana so that you don't see anything, and then say this is just spontaneous art.
What do you think is the price of not seeing? Because one of the things that strikes me is when you talk about the Dalit body specifically, and the criticism that's leveled at you, how can you look at the Dalit body in this specific way? What I hear is very much the same fear that people have had historically over how can you portray a Black man as desirable, especially to a white woman, right? And when people react with that much vitriol and violence, often what I see and hear is a fear of seeing their own humanity in that other, in that Dalit body, in that Black man, in George Floyd. So I'm curious, what do you think is at risk of seeing?
I think that, in the case of, anyway, in the God of Small Things, it's also the fear of the woman's desire, that the woman is also not a white woman who's just seeking some, something on the side. She's also a raging woman, she's also a woman who's been set aside and discarded in some way and refused. She's expected to live like as if her life is over, and she's saying it's not over, and there's a kind of, I think there's a line where I said, Amu combined the infinite tenderness of motherhood with the reckless rage of a suicide bomber. She's like a dangerous woman too. Yeah. So all together there was this unease, and I think but that isn't that what we do as writers. We refuse the rhetoric, right? Although rhetoric is important, but we put a world full of its complications and its contradictions and its humanity and its brutality on the table. And then I say, but once you've seen it, you can't unsee it. I mean, like, you can't wake up someone who's pretending to sleep, right? Like, then you know that they're faking it because they're scared of opening their eyes. But I see, for example, what is going on in the US right now as a wonderful triumph of art. I think the years of poetry, of music, of literature, of sport that the African American community has put on the table, and it outshines the best of the best, so it has made itself something very, very beautiful, because just anger can't get us anywhere. The creation of our humanity is in the hands of us, the writers and the poets and the people, and if rage is a part of our clay, that's fine, but creating something beautiful is a weapon that cannot be destroyed.
My goodness. I'm gonna put that in a piece of paper and stare at it every day. That's so powerful. Because it is, because I think a lot of times as writers, it can feel sometimes we can feel helpless with like what exactly is our role. And we know that in any social movement, artists play this critical role because oftentimes we are the ones that bring the heart. We are the ones that can connect. And we are the ones that are gonna create archives that will outlive everybody.
The slogans, yeah.
Right?
No, so what I'm saying is that's something that's happening now in the US. It isn't, I mean, George Floyd was obviously a spark, but the bonfire, the kindling, the firewood, everything was put there by whom? Over how many years,
Right.
Over how many years? It's a formidable, it's a formidable revolution because I think there's art at the heart of it, brilliant art, not, like while I mean, I'll tell you a reverse story about art and politics. Like while I refuse this bullshit about, like there's some anodyne kind of art that's not political, but there's the other thing which friends of, when I got involved with the anti-dam movement early on. So first, some of those activists called me and they said, we have some painters have given us some paintings to raise funds and we're going to have a show and will you come and inaugurate it? So I said, no, I don't do this inauguration stuff. I don't do this symbolic things. So they said, okay, then will you just come for it? I said, sure. So I went and I found that, it was just like artists had just given their kind of not very good paintings and these guys had hung them upside down and whatever. I just left. So then my friends, who are now my very close friends, said, Arundhati, when we first met you, we thought you're a very cruel person. So I said, why? They said, you just came there and looked at these paintings and you just laughed and left. So I said, look, boss, there's no excuse for bad art. Right? like, please, just because you're political doesn't give you a pass to create mediocrity, That's also very, very important because there are a lot of charlatans trying to pass, through the hallway. And they don't get a pass just because, whatever, they have the right billboards.
Yep. Yeah.
No.
I love that. So will you read something else to us? What else did you have?
Yeah. I want to, there's so many parts of the ministry I'd like to read, but I'm going to read about Kashmir. Okay? So there's the book, The Ministry of Utmost Happiness. And this is towards the end. It's from chapter 9. It's called The Untimely Death of Miss Jubin the First. Ever since she was old enough to insist, she had insisted on being called Miss Jubin. It was the only name she would answer to. Everyone had to call her that. Her parents, her grandparents, the neighbors too. She was a precocious devotee of the Miss fetish that had gripped the Kashmir Valley in the early years of the insurrection. All of a sudden, fashionable young ladies, especially in the towns, insisted on being addressed as Miss Momin, Miss Ghazala, Miss Farhana. It was only one of the many fetishes of the times. In those blood-dimmed years, for reasons nobody fully understood, people became what can only be described as fetish-prone. Other than the Miss fetish, there was a nurse fetish, a PT instructor fetish, and a roller skating fetish. So in addition to checkposts, bunkers, weapons, grenades, landmines, cassepiers, concertina wire, soldiers, insurgents, counterinsurgents, spies, special operatives, double agents, triple agents, and suitcases of cash from the agencies on both sides of the border. the valley was also awash with nurses, PT instructors, and roller skaters. And of course, Mrs. Among them, Miss Jibin, who didn't live long enough to become a nurse, nor even a roller skater. In the Mazar-e-Shohada, the martyr's graveyard, where she was first buried, the cast iron signboard that arched over the main gate said in 2 languages, "We gave our todays for your tomorrows." It's corroded now, the green paint faded, the delicate calligraphy flecked with pinholes of light. Still, there it is, after all those years, silhouetted like a swatch of stiff lace against the sapphire sky and the snowy, saw-toothed mountains. There it still is. Miss Jabin was not a member of the committee that decided what should be written on the signboard, but she was in no position to argue with its decision. Also, Miss Jabin hadn't notched up very many todays to trade in for tomorrows. But then the algebra of infinite justice was never so rude. In this way, without being consulted on the matter, she became one of the movement's youngest martyrs. She was buried right next to her mother, Begum Arfa Yesui. Mother and daughter died by the same bullet. It entered Miss Jabin's head through her left temple and came to rest in her mother's heart. In the last photograph of her, the bullet wound looked like a cheerful summer rose arranged just above her left ear. A few petals had fallen on the white shroud she was wrapped in before she was laid to rest. Miss Jabin and her mother were buried along with 15 others, taking the toll of their massacre to 17. At the time of their funeral, the Mazar-e-Shohada was still fairly new, but was already getting crowded. However, the Intizamiya committee, the organizing committee, had its ear to the ground from the very beginning of the insurrection and had a realistic idea of things to come. It planned the layout of the graves carefully, making ordered, efficient use of the available space. Everyone understood how important it was to bury martyrs' bodies in collective burial grounds and not leave them scattered in their thousands like bird feed up in the mountains or in the forests around the army camps and torture centers that had mushroomed across the valley. When the fighting began and the occupation tightened its grip, for ordinary people, the consolidation of their dead became in itself an act of defiance.
Thank you for reading that. It's sobering, and I think part of the reason why it's so sobering is because there is a cost to be paid. I think Mahohodi had asked earlier, what is the cost of not seeing? And, you know, to me, that passage really speaks very clearly to the cost of standing. And, you know, one of the things that I thought as I was making my way through the Capitalism, a ghost story book, is, you know, you've exposed in many ways these complex networks that exist to put, you know, all this power. It's really about power and controlling a lot of times, even in the arts. And you've told stories, I know, about voices that have been erased from history because they dared to reveal these truths. And so there has been a great cause that to the individual that you have through your work revealed, and there has been a cost to you as well. I mean, there were times when you had to flee your own country because you were in danger. So I wonder if you can talk a little bit about both the cost of standing up and why we should do it.
Well, it's a very, you know, I mean, when you know the things that are happening across the world, in your country, in South Africa, in Egypt, in Turkey, in China, in Bangladesh, in Pakistan, in India, you know, all of us, you know, what I find hard is how do you you know, because the price you pay is often private. The price you pay is often, you know, is often sort of hard when you put it in the global account book. You know, it's like it's personal, but it's also so public. You know, so every day, for example, now people I know are being arrested every single day. You know, and and but you know, these are not the only prices that we pay of being arrested or being tried or going to jail or getting killed. You know, there's so many, there's a spectrum of other things that happen to people. But when you look around you, you realize that, but you know, everybody is being crushed. Everybody who's speaking up in some way or the other is either being silenced. I mean, I remember the book of interviews of mine called The Checkbook and the Cruise Missile, you know. So it's either you're being co-opted or you're being crushed in some ways. And then some of us are just kind of negotiating the cracks of the institutions and, you know, somehow keeping afloat. And it's important to keep afloat. It's important not to feel like a martyr. It's important to hang on to love and beauty and ferocity and all of that, you know. And that is a kind of art too, of how do you do it, and when do you step back, when do you step forward, when do you step sideways, when do you make solidarities. And sometimes the hardest thing is how this power and this money and this pedagogy that has been, I mean, I see it so clearly in the US, years of literally the corporatization of pedagogy can excise a whole section or a whole way of thinking. It can be, the other part can be very, very sophisticated, but a whole way of thinking has been excised, and right now it's making a big comeback. The talk about capitalism and class. And so caste, for example, in India is designed to destroy solidarity. Mm-hmm. It's designed to siloize people, to make every person in the caste system is oppressed by somebody and can oppress somebody. And so it's like a gigantic surveillance system to keep the power in place, you know. And in so many ways, that is the same thing. I actually wanted to read you a part from this essay, Capitalism, A Ghost Story. Just a little bit about, because it's the two of you, I picked it up this morning and I thought, let me just see, because it's a very, very interesting thing, you know. It's about, the essay is about these massive foundations where corporations create foundations, not just as tax evasion, but as charities, as policy bodies, and eventually it's about the privatization of policy making itself, you know. And how these huge organizations have de-radicalized movements, and no doubt are hard at work trying to de-radicalize Black Lives Matter now, for sure. You know, I don't know the details, but I'm willing to wager anything. And the way they will de-radicalize it is by throwing a lot of money around, by separating moderate from radical, you know, and cultivate one and gradually push the other over the cliff. Divide, 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 and rule. So this is sort of in the middle of the lecture, but I just thought I must read it to you, this part. Having worked out how to manage governments, political parties, elections, courts, the media, and liberal opinion, the neoliberal establishment faced one more challenge: how to deal with growing unrest, the threat of quote unquote people's power. How do you domesticate it? How do you turn protesters into pets? How do you vacuum up people's fury and redirect it into blind alleys. Here too, foundations and their allied organizations have a long and illustrious history. A revealing example is their role in diffusing and de-radicalizing the Black civil rights movement in the United States in the 1960s, and the successful transformation of Black power into Black capitalism. The Rockefeller Foundation, in keeping with J.D. Rockefeller's ideals, had worked closely with the Martin Luther King Sr., father of Martin Luther King Jr., but his influence waned with the rise of the more militant organizations, the Students' Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, and the Black Panthers. The Ford and Rockefeller Foundations moved in. In 1970, they donated $15 million to moderate Black organizations, giving people grants, fellowships, scholarships, job training programs for dropouts, and seed money for Black-owned businesses. Repression, infighting, and the honey trap of funding led to the gradual atrophying of the radical Black organizations. Martin Luther King Jr. made the forbidden connection between capitalism, imperialism, racism, and the Vietnam War. As a result, after he was assassinated, even his memory became toxic, a threat to public order. Foundations and corporations worked hard to remodel his legacy to fit a market-friendly format. The Martin Luther King Jr. Center for Nonviolent Social Change, with an operational grant of $2 million, was set up by, among others, the Ford Motor Company, General Motors, Mobil, Western Electric, Procter & Gamble, US Steel, and Monsanto. The center maintains the King Library and archives of the civil rights movement. Among the many programs the King Center runs have been projects that, quote, work closely with the United States Department of Defense, the Armed Forces Chaplains Board, and others. It co-sponsored the Martin Luther King Jr. lecture series called, quote, The Free Enterprise System, an Agent for Non-Violent Social Change. Amen. A similar coup was carried out in the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa. In 1978, the Rockefeller Foundation organized a study commission on US policy and towards Southern Africa. The report warned of the growing influence of the Soviet Union on the ANC and said that US strategic corporate interests, that is access to South Africa's minerals, would be best served if there were genuine sharing of political power by all races. The foundations began to support the ANC. The ANC soon turned on the more radical organizations like Steve Biko's Black Consciousness Movement and more or less eliminated it. When Mandela took over as South Africa's first Black president, he was canonized as a living saint, not just because he's a freedom fighter who spent 27 years in prison, but also because he deferred completely to the Washington consensus. Socialism disappeared from the ANC's agenda. South Africa's great, quote unquote, peaceful transition, so praised and lauded, meant no land reforms, no demand for reparation, no nationalization of South Africa's mines. Instead, there was privatization and structural adjustment. Mandela gave South Africa's highest civilian award, the Order of Good Hope, to his old friend and supporter, General Suharto, the killer of hundreds of thousands of communists in Indonesia. Today in South Africa, a clutch of Mercedes-Benz driving former radicals and trade unionists rule the country. But that is more than enough to perpetuate the myth of Black liberation. So they've done that with the Dalit movement, they've done that with the feminist movement. You know, how do you basically de-radicalize and bring it all into a situation where you know, capitalism is happy. So there is some great work that happens, but anything that threatens the economic order is axed, you know. So they also define feminism. So feminism has become NGOized, and sort of white liberal feminism, of course, was the reason the front used to bomb Afghanistan, as though dropping daisy cutters can bomb feminism into a place, you know. And even in India, you have hundreds of thousands of women fighting against the dispossession of their villages, their land, their submergence by dams, the takeover of their homelands by mining companies. But those women are not considered feminist, you know. So you have to see the whole picture to understand how insidious this is.
Yeah, one thing that I wanted to bring attention to, I was really struck by this sentence, and I want to talk to you about it. You said, armed with billions, these NGOs have waded into the world, turning potential revolutionaries into salaried activists, funding artists, intellectuals, filmmakers, gently luring them away from radical confrontation, ushering them in the direction of multiculturalism, gender equity, community development, the discourse couched in the language of identity politics and human rights. And I was really struck by that, because I think, later on when the section you read, it's another kind of note in that same sequence where you're talking about how, as artists, part of the machine, what it wants to do is, again, break down solidarity, break down radical transformation. And oftentimes the way that happens is through the insertion of these other paths through change, which often don't lead to real lasting change. So my question to you really is about, really, as artists, how do we do it? Because it's a big machine in place, yeah. And we already can tell, we can see from the past when really radical voices have come through, the Black Panthers. I mean, there have been real community grassroots movements that have been halted, as you said. And I just wonder what thoughts you have for those of us who are now trying to invoke real change. How do we do it?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I feel that I haven't spent very much time in the United States, but I do have very close friends, and I'm in touch all the time. And I feel that maybe, I hope anyway, maybe this young generation is alert to this process, is alert to understanding, because money thrown at you can be like radioactive waste, like it can just end up in a process of completely kind of atrophying real politics, and that has to come from an understanding of the fact that all of it is linked, the Black Lives Matter movement has to be linked to what the United States has been doing in the...
Oh, sorry, Arundhati, looks like we're losing you here a little.
Pakistan to all across South America, Latin America, how can it not be connected, So if we all fight in our little bubble and are at the end of the day waving flags and singing national anthems, I mean, I know over here, I mean, my collection of nonfiction is called My Seditious Heart, My Seditious Heart, because everyone's constantly, telling me that I'm not, patriotic enough and nationalist enough. And I keep saying I'm either too old, too ancient, or too modern for this, but, we write about times before these borders existed, and about feelings that run much deeper than all of this. This is just, so how do we understand the machinery of the world? We can't do much by ourselves. We can't rise up in revolution by ourselves, but we can surely understand, and we can surely understand when our edges are being sandpapered down and we are being turned into pets, you know.
Well, I'm curious. I mean, I think Clevis's question is so important, actually, especially for this moment, because for a lot of us who, as she says, are coming up, we look at somebody like you as an elder and as someone who has walked this path before, right? And I'm wondering how exactly have you managed to do it, you know, to resist that sanding down of those edges that are important in order to face what is hard? I mean, I don't imagine that the work that you have done has always been a joy park, like, you know, always fun, or something that you wake up looking forward to, like, yes, today I'm going to face this military.
Well, no, I mean, you know, the thing is that one of the things that that I'm always, you know, I find it very complicated to talk about this because, you know, all our journeys are eventually so unique, you know. So for me, like I said, you know, from the time I was very young, I needed to get away from where I grew up, and I was so I was always desperate for a sort of economic, like, independence, you know. And it didn't matter how fragile it was or where I lived. I just couldn't abide the idea of being told what to do. I just couldn't, you know, or what to wear or how to think. I don't know. I mean, I just couldn't. So I left home. But anyway, whatever, I studied architecture and things. And when I wrote The God of Small Things, suddenly that economic independence just became almost embarrassing, you know, because it was like this book that sold millions and millions of copies. And I was suddenly somebody who I never thought I'd want to be, even, you know, someone with a kind of bank account that was burgeoning just because I wrote a book. Like, I was like, you know, I said, can't I just, you know, like I said, all I would want was to go to somewhere and say, hey, I wrote this, can you give me lunch, you know? I don't need to become this person. But along with that, you know, sort of material success and winning that big prize, I immediately sensed domestication, you know, because fame is also a kind of domestication. Everybody wants you to do the same thing again. Everybody wants to invite you to that place in the light. I wasn't interested, you know. So the minute that happened, I just shut the door. I said, I'm out of here, you know, like, God knows if I'll ever write another book again or whatever. I just disappeared. And then within like a few months of, obviously, because, you know, I live in India, and at that point, for an Indian woman to have won this big international prize, I was on the cover of every magazine, and I was this sort of, it was just this invitation to be this representative of something which I wasn't sure I was cut out for. But then there were the nuclear tests, because this right-wing government that's now really in power, it first came to power just a few months after this, and then they did the nuclear tests. And I was being invited to be the representative of this country that was now taking its place at the high table. And I just, you know, it was being celebrated by not me, these nuclear tests and this new India, this corporate India. It was being celebrated by everyone, including artists and filmmakers. And when the test happened, I didn't have a choice, you know. Either I was going to be there, even if I said nothing, I was going to be, you know, one of the many faces of this brave new country, or I was going to take a position and step off the pedestal, which is what I did. When I wrote this essay called The End of Imagination, about how having nuclear weapons colonizes your imagination, whether you use them or not. It changed the discourse, the public discourse, the acceptable way we spoke in public, you know. It changed that. It brought in this Hindu nationalism. And so I wrote The End of Imagination, and one of the passages which outraged people said that I spoke about how having nuclear weapons is like putting meat hooks into your brain in terms of just colonizing the way you think and making you like everybody else, you know. And it wasn't about just about the possibility of nuclear war, but it was of what have we done to this unique place that we were, with all its horrors, you know. So I said, if it's considered anti-national and anti-Hindu to have this nuclear device implanted in my brain, then I secede. I declare myself a mobile republic, you know. So this was just like the beginning of this. She's anti-national, she's a seditionist. And I said, so be it, whatever it is, you know. And I was quickly kicked off that pedestal. And, you know, from then onwards, it's just everything that you write is so, you know, it's like court cases, police cases, you know, every sentence, every video, every whatever. It's like the glare and the hostility and the love. I mean, it's also that, you know, it's a battle, and those of us who are fighting are also many, you know. So yes, it's a price to pay, but you know, if you don't do it, and once you start stepping back, it's like it affects every sentence you write. For me, you know, it affects everything I do. It would be like putting myself into a padded cell or into a prison. I would rather a real one than one constructed in my own head, where I'm unable to think freely, you know. So, but as I said, I'm not one of those people who wants to be a martyr and who wants to, like, I think you really have to learn how to dance, you know. You have to learn what to say, when to say it, when to shut up, when to not shut up. or, you know, obviously one will make mistakes and so on, but to keep that raggedness of spirit, it's an art, you know. Like even about language, like when I finished architecture, all of my classmates got some scholarship or the other to, you know, some fancy college in the US, and I felt that if I went to a, you know, if I went to Oxford or Cambridge or MIT or something, I'm sure I would have become a more sort of sophisticated person in some ways. But I felt like I would have lost my language, you know. I would have lost my way of writing, which is a language that has been cooked in a cauldron by me, with lots of other languages thrown in, because we are a land of many languages. And somehow I would have probably it was like, am I going to just make my own clothes, or am I going to go and buy some really nice clothes from a really nice store? I should say I'll make my own clothes. I'll stay here and I'll make my own language, you know?
We're so lucky for it. Thank you for making that choice. And I know it's been costly. I mean, like you said before, there's a personal cost that is public, and there's a way in which you know, the relentless pursuit of your integrity and of your artistry. We've seen it over the decades, and I mean, we feel really, it's a blessing to us that you didn't give up. We thank you for that.
Yes, I mean, it's also important to I mean, this is what I wanted to read at the end, but it's like my manifesto. But since I talked about The End of Imagination. Shall I read it?
Please.
This
Please.
So this is just in the midst of this this essay. In early May, before the tests, I left home for 3 weeks. While I was away, I met a friend of mine whom I've always loved for, among other things, her ability to combine deep affection with a frankness that borders on savagery. I've been thinking about you, she said, about the God of small things, what's in it, what's over it, under it, around it, above it. She fell silent for a while. I was uneasy and not at all sure that I wanted to hear the rest of what she had to say. She, however, was sure that she was going to say it. In this last year, less than a year actually, you've had too much of everything. Fame, money, prizes, adulation, criticism, condemnation, ridicule, love, hate, anger, envy, generosity, everything. In some ways, it's a perfect story, perfectly baroque in its excess. The trouble is that it has, or can have, only one perfect ending. Her eyes were on me, bright with a slanting, probing brilliance. She knew that I knew what she was going to say. She was insane. She was going to say that nothing that happened to me in the future could ever match the buzz of this, that the whole of the rest of my life was going to be vaguely unsatisfying, and therefore the only perfect ending to the story would be death, my death. I told my friend, there was no such thing as a perfect story. I said, in any case, hers was an external view of things, this assumption that the trajectory of a person's happiness, or let's say fulfillment, had peaked and now must trough because she had accidentally stumbled upon, quote unquote, success. It was premised on the unimaginative belief that wealth and fame were the mandatory stuff of everybody's dreams. You've lived too long in New York, I told her. There are other worlds, other kinds of dreams. Dreams in which failure is feasible, honorable, sometimes even worth striving for. Worlds in which recognition is not the only barometer of brilliance or human worth. There are plenty of warriors whom I know and love, people far more valuable than myself, who go to war each day, knowing in advance that they will fail. True, they are less successful in the most vulgar sense of the word, but by no means less fulfilled. The only dream worth having, I told her, is to dream that you will live while you're alive and die only when you're dead. Which means exactly what? Arched eyebrows, a little annoyed. I tried to explain to her, but didn't do a very good job of it. Sometimes I need to write to think. So I wrote it down for her on a paper napkin. And this is what I wrote. To love, to be loved, to never forget your own insignificance, to never get used to the unspeakable violence and the vulgar disparity of life around you, to seek joy in the saddest places, to pursue beauty to its lair, to never simplify what is complicated or complicate what is simple, to respect strength, never power, above all to watch, to try and understand, to never look away, and never, never to forget.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful.
So that's how one you do have to I think never strike the same single note all the time. It's like the fitness of a writer is your range, your ability to run without breathing heavily, to move lightly, you know, to to not to not only grieve, to not only rage, to not only fight, to not only laugh, to not only laugh, but to do all of it. You know?
But can you talk a little bit more about that love? Because one of the things that really struck me, and I'm going to quote her here, Alice Walker says about you that the fierceness with which Arundhati Roy loves humanity moves my heart. And when you read that passage, and you're talking about love, to love, and to be present to life, which ultimately is love, right? I'm really curious about how you define that depth of love, and how do we occupy that, and how do we take that into this portal?
Well, I think the first thing is that we can't occupy it. You know, we have to understand the impermanence of everything and celebrate that. You know, I think the idea of trying to make everything permanent is what has been such a heavy footfall. You know, human beings have been so clumsy in that. You know, and the beauty of being able to know what makes you happy and know that it will pass and then something else will come. You know, I just feel that if you're alert to what is so beautiful around us, alongside of all the horror, because after all, if we don't love anything, then what are we fighting for? You know, what is the purpose? For what? I mean, unless you want to be like some psycho soldier who can't live without war or something, you know. But like here in India, even in the midst of horror, and I have to admit a sense of great defeat, because we have been pushed into a place which looks like a very deep well, you know. We have watched a lot of beauty being erased, and I have seen that, you know, when we talk about fascism, the really troubling thing about it is not when it is demonstrated by leaders, but when it's demonstrated by people, when it's demonstrated on the streets, when it's demonstrated in the celebration of murderers and lynchers and so on, you know? And yet there's just not a day that passes when one's heart doesn't just smile at something here. Not a day, you know. Like, I mean, I remember the, you know, these fairs where people bring their cattle and they, you know, there are embroideries and there are jewelry and there, in these village places, and there was this old man sitting there without any wares, but he had a sign which said "5 paise mein ek baat," which means he give me 5 paisa, which 5 paisa is like the smallest possible coin you could have. You give me 5 paisa, I'll tell you something. Like, you know, oh, the kind of crazy humor. So, you know, the ephemeralness of all this, you know, just people drifting by, and like even here where I live, it's just like in the lockdown, you know, a dog. We have so many street dogs here, not like US. Huh? So she just came and produced 7 puppies outside my door.
Wow.
I'm like, thank you.
Wow.
You know, like it's just whatever. So as long as you don't become closed to moments of beauty, you know, that's how you carry on. And yet you don't become like a idiot, you know, not noticing the big wheels turning or the machinery or the nuts and bolts. To me, all of it matters, you know.
I think that's a perfect place to say thank you for being with us. And we are so grateful.
thank you. I really enjoyed being with you. Okay.
Well, thank you so much again, Arundhati Roy.
Yes, so welcome.
It was wonderful being with you. And thank you for everybody tuning in. This is Love is a Kind of Cure's Freedom Festival. Our next gathering is going to be on Saturday, and we're speaking about food and the intersection between food and inequality. Hope you can join us for that.